We can give John our full attention, and then we'll open up, after John is done, we're going to open up for a question and answer period, okay?
Okay.
Thank you. Okay, John is a historian and storyteller. You've been at this for quite a while, John.
Yes, I have.
And he put together this awesome presentation on Martin Luther King. So let's start. I'm excited to hear.
Well, thank you to all of you for joining in from Sudbury Senior Center. Get up, get out, get active. Even in these times, if you can get out just to even look at the sun and sit in the sun for 15 minutes, it'll do you a world of good. And of course, thanks to the Friends of the Sudbury Seniors. These opinions that I express are those of myself, John Horrigan, and do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Sudbury Council on Aging or the Friends of the Sudbury Seniors. So any content that I provide is of my own personal opinion, not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, individual, or anyone or anything. As Sharon mentioned, I was a host of a TV show called The Folklorist. I was a lucky recipient of 5 Boston, New England Emmy Awards, and also 20 nominations. And I was also lucky enough to receive 13 Telly Awards, 7 Communicator Awards, and the station New TV in Newton went back-to-back nationally for arts and entertainment in the Alliance for Community Media. But the program ran from 2011 to 2016, and I'm currently working on a bunch of historical TV shows that are in development. So let's look at Martin Luther King. He was born January 15th, 1929. I was born January 16th, in Atlanta, Georgia, to the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr., who lived until 1984, and Alberta Williams King, who lived until 1974. Now, King's legal name at birth was Michael King, and his father was also born Michael King. But the elder King changed his and his son's names following a 1934 trip to Germany to attend the 5th Baptist World Alliance Congress in Berlin. Now, of course, it was during this time that he chose to be called Martin Luther King in honor of the German reformer Martin Luther. But he also had Irish ancestry through his paternal great-grandfather, as well as African ancestry. Now, he was between an older sister, Willie Christine King, and a younger brother, Alfred Daniel Williams. And he sang with his church choir at the 1939 Atlanta premiere of the movie Gone with the Wind. And Martin liked to sing, and he loved music. It's pretty good. He was accomplished. His mother was an accomplished organist and choir leader, and she took him to various churches to sing. And he received attention for singing "I Want to Be More and More Like Jesus," and later became a member of the junior choir in his church. Now, Martin's father regularly whipped him until he was about 15. In fact, a neighbor reported hearing the elder King telling his son that he would, quote, make something out of him even if he had to beat him to death. Martin never forgot that. And he was proud and fearless, and he protested against segregation. And Martin Luther King Sr. refused to listen to a traffic policeman after being referred to as boy. And he also stalked out of a store with his son when he was told by a shoe clerk that they would have to move to the rear of the store in order to be served. Now, Martin, when he was a child, befriended a white boy whose father owned a business near his family's home. And when the boys were 6, they started school. Martin had to attend a school for African Americans, while the other boy went to one for whites, because public schools were still among the facilities segregated by state law in Georgia. And unfortunately, Martin lost his friend because the child's father no longer wanted the boys to play together, the white child's father. So Martin battled depression throughout much of his life. And in his adolescent years, he initially felt resentment against white people due to racial humiliation that he, his family, and his neighbors often had to endure in the segregated South. And at the age of 12, shortly after his maternal grandmother died, Martin was so hurt, he blamed himself and jumped out of a second-story window, but luckily survived. Now, King both embraced and refuted some of Christianity's claims. At the age of 13, he denied the bodily resurrection of Jesus during Sunday school. Just move here. I have okay, here we go. From this point, though, he stated that doubts began to spring forth unrelentingly about Christianity, but finally, he concluded that the Bible has many profound truths which one cannot escape, and then he decided to enter the seminary. So growing up, he attended Booker T. Washington High School, and he became known for his public speaking ability, and he was part of the school's debate team. Now, I would say he was the greatest speaker in American oratorical history, especially in the 20th century. A lot of his speeches that we'll be talking about, literally, he scratched out some notes beforehand, but spoke from the heart, and it shows. So Martin became the youngest assistant manager of a newspaper delivery station for the Atlanta Journal in 1942 when he was only 13. And he won first prize in an oratorical contest sponsored by the Negro Elks Club in Dublin, Georgia. And then returning home to Atlanta by bus, though, he and his teacher were ordered by the driver to stand so white passengers could sit down. And of course, King was furious, but he complied after his teacher told him that he would be breaking the law if he did not submit. And at that point, Martin said about this incident, he was the angriest that he's ever been in his life. He was a precocious student, very intelligent. He skipped both the 9th and the 12th grades of high school. And during high school, Morehouse College, which was a respected historically black college, announced that it would accept any high school juniors who could pass its entrance exam. The reason why is because a lot of students had abandoned further studies to enlist in World War II. And due to this, Morehouse was eager to fill its classrooms. And Martin passed the exam and entered Morehouse. In the summer before his last year at Morehouse in 1947, at 18 years old, he chose to enter the ministry. He had concluded that the church offered the most assuring way to answer an inner urge to serve humanity. Now, King's inner urge had begun developing, and he made peace with the Baptist church as he believed he would be a rational minister with sermons that were a respectful force for ideas, even social protest. So he graduated from Morehouse with a BA degree in sociology, and then he enrolled in Crozier Theological Seminary in Chester, Pennsylvania, and he would graduate there in 1951. And of course, his father fully supported his decision to continue his education. Now, he was joined by a friend by the name of McCall in the seminary, a former classmate at Morehouse. And at Crozier, he was elected president of the student body. And the African-American students of Crozier, for the most part, conducted their social activity on a place in Chester, Pennsylvania, known as Edward Street. And there he became fond of the street because a classmate had an aunt who prepared collard greens for them, which both of the boys relished. Now, King, he scolded a student for keeping beer in his room, saying that they shared responsibility as African Americans to, quote, bear the burdens of the Negro race. And for a time, he was interested in Walter Rauschenbusch's social gospel. And in his third year at Morehouse, he became romantically involved with the white daughter of an immigrant German woman who worked as a cook in the cafeteria. Now, this woman had been involved previously with a professor in the same college before her relationship with Martin. But Martin wanted to marry her, but friends advised against it, saying that such an interracial marriage would provoke animosity from both blacks and whites, potentially damaging his chances of ever pastoring a church in the South. So King told a friend that he could not endure his mother's pain over the marriage, and then he broke off the relationship 6 months later. But he continued to have lingering feelings towards the woman he left. One friend was quoted as saying that Martin never recovered. But he married Coretta Scott on June 18, 1953, on the lawn of her parents' house in her hometown of Heiberger, Alabama. He was 24, she was 26. And they would go on to have 4 children: Yolanda, born 1955, Martin Luther III, born 1957, Dexter Scott, born 1961, and Bernice, born 1963. And during their marriage, King limited Coretta's role in the civil rights movement, expecting her to be a housewife and a mother. So he was called as a pastor of the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama. And he began doctoral studies in systematic theology at Boston University, and he received his PhD degree on June 5, 1955, with a dissertation on a comparison of the conceptions of God and the thinking of Paul Tillich and Henry Nelson Wyman. Now, while he was continuing his doctoral studies, he worked as an assistant minister at Boston's historic 12th Baptist Church with Reverend William Hunter Hester, who was an old friend of Martin's father, and he became an important influence on Martin Luther King Jr. Now, during an inquiry in October of 1991, people at Boston University concluded that portions of his dissertation had been plagiarized and that he had acted improperly. However, the school said despite its finding, the committee said that no thought should be given to the revocation of Dr. King's doctoral degree, an action that the panel said would serve no purpose. Now, also, they found that the dissertation still makes an intelligent contribution to scholarship. And a letter is now attached to the copy of King's dissertation held in the university library, noting that numerous passages were included without the appropriate quotations and citations of sources. Now, Claudette Colvin, a 15-year-old schoolgirl in Montgomery, Alabama, refused to give up her seat in December 1955 to a white man in compliance with the Jim Crow laws, which were local regulations in the southern United States that enforced racial segregation. And they formed a committee from the Birmingham African American community that looked into the case. But because Claudette was pregnant and unmarried, and she was also very feisty, E.G. Nixon above and Clifford Durr below decided to wait for a better case to pursue, and that happened when Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat in December of 1955. So what they formed was the Montgomery Bus Boycott, and it was urged and planned by Nixon and led by King. Others obviously participated, including Joanne Robinson, who was very influential on Aurelia Browder, who refused to give up her seat, Claudette Colvin, and of course Rosa Parks. But this boycott lasted over a year, 385 days, and the situation became so intense that King's house was actually bombed. Now, King was behind this campaign, which concluded with a U.S. District Court ruling in Browder versus Gale that ended racial segregation on all Montgomery public buses. I got a chance to read the transcript of testimony of Claudette Colvin, Rosa Parks, and Aurelia Browder, and it was fascinating. It was held in the Alabama Middle District Court, Northern Division, and led to a Supreme Court ruling. Anyways, Martin Luther King's role in the bus boycott transformed him into a national figure and the best-known spokesman of the civil rights movement. Also involved were men like, I cannot see the top of my screen, unfortunately. This thing is blocking me. Let me just stop here 1 second. There we go. Okay, great. Excellent. So in 1957, Ralph King Abernathy, Fred Shuttlesworth, Joseph Lowery, and other civil rights activists founded the SCLC, that is, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And you'll hear me refer to the SCLC. Okay. So this group was created to harness the moral authority and organizing power of Black churches to conduct nonviolent protests in the service of civil rights reform. And one of the group's inspirations was the crusades of evangelist Billy Graham, who befriended Martin Luther King after Martin attended a Graham crusade in New York City in 1957. And Martin would lead the SCLC until his death. So the SCLC's 1957 prayer pilgrimage for freedom was the first time King addressed a national audience. And other civil rights leaders involved in the SCLC with Martin included James Bevel, Alan Johnson, Curtis W. Harris, Walter E. Fauntroy, C.T. Vivian, Andrew Young, the Freedom Singers, Charles Evers, Cleveland Robinson, Randolph Blackwell, Annie Bell Robinson Devine, Charles Kenzie Steele, Alfred Daniel Williams King, Benjamin Cooks, Aaron Henry, and Bayard Rustin. Then, on September 20th, 1958, while signing copies of his book Stride Toward Freedom in Bloomstein's department store in Harlem, New York, King narrowly escaped death when Isola Curry, a mentally ill Black woman who believed he was conspiring against her with communists, and she stabbed him in the chest with a letter opener. But after emergency surgery, he was hospitalized for several weeks, while Curry was found mentally incompetent to stand trial. Now, in 1959, he published a short book called The Measure of a Man, which contained his sermons, including What is Man and the Dimensions of a Complete Life. Now, the sermons argued for man's need for God's love and criticized the racial injustices of Western civilization. In fact, the Gandhi Society for Human Rights was a fund founded by leaders of the nonviolent civil rights movement, and Martin was very much aware and liked the practices of Gandhi in of peaceful demonstrations. He also liked the civil disobedience by peace by Henry David Thoreau, but he was inspired certainly by Mahatma Gandhi. And he served as the honorary president for the group. And here's a quote: "In the struggle for human rights and justice, Negroes will make a mistake if they become bitter and indulge in hate campaigns." Martin Luther King. But he was displeased with the pace of President John F. Kennedy's addressing the issue of segregation. So King, along with the Gandhi Society, produced a document in 1962 calling on the president to follow in the footsteps of Abraham Lincoln and use an executive order to deliver a blow for civil rights as a kind of second Emancipation Proclamation. Now, the FBI, under a written directive from attorney Robert F. Kennedy, began tapping King's telephone in the fall of 1963. They were not friends after that when Martin felt betrayed by Bob Kennedy. So Kennedy was concerned that allegations of communists in the SCLC, if they were made public, would derail the administration's civil rights initiatives. So Kennedy warned King to discontinue the suspect associations, and later he felt compelled to issue the directive authorizing the FBI to wiretap Martin Luther King and his associates. I always cringe when I see this man's photo. J. Edgar Hoover feared communists were trying to infiltrate the civil rights movement. But when no such evidence emerged, the Bureau used the incidental details caught on tape over the next 5 years in attempts to force King out of the preeminent leadership position. Blackmail. Now, King believed that organized, nonviolent protest against the system of Southern segregation, again known as the Jim Crow laws, would lead to extensive media coverage of the struggle for black equality and voting rights. Journalistic accounts and televised footage of the daily deprivation and indignities suffered by Southern blacks and of segregationist violence and harassment of civil rights workers and marchers produced a wave of sympathetic public opinion that convinced the majority of Americans that the civil rights movement was the most important issue in American politics in the early 1960s. And he organized and led marches for blacks' right to vote, desegregation, labor rights, and other basic civil rights. And most of these rights were successfully enacted into the law of the United States with the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Both passed during the Johnson administration, but they were certainly moved forward. The foundations of them were put in place by the Kennedy administration. So King and the SCLC put into practice many of the principles of the Christian left and applied the tactics of nonviolent protest with great success by strategically choosing the method of protest and the places in which the protests were carried out. Now, there were often dramatic standoffs with segregationist authorities, and sometimes these confrontations became violent. Now, throughout his participation in the civil rights movement, King was criticized by many groups, which included opposition by more militant blacks, such as Nation of Islam member Malcolm X. He would later leave the Nation of Islam. Separatist Stokely Carmichael and Omali Yeshitela. Now, the Albany Movement was a desegregation coalition formed in Albany, Georgia, in November of 1961, and a month later, the SCLC, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, became involved. Now, this movement mobilized thousands of citizens for a broad front, nonviolent attack on every aspect of segregation within the city, and it attracted nationwide attention. And when Martin first visited on December 15, 1961, he had planned to stay a day or so and return home after giving counsel. The following day, December 16th, however, he was swept up in a mass arrest of peaceful demonstrators, and he declined bail until the city made concessions. According to King, that agreement was dishonored and violated by the city after he left town. So, King returned in July of 1962, was sentenced to 45 days in jail or a $178 fine, and he chose jail. 3 days into his sentence, Police Chief Laurie Pritchett discreetly arranged for King's fine to be paid and ordered his release. Martin said, quote, "We had witnessed persons being kicked off lunch counter stools, ejected from churches, and thrown into jail. But for the first time, we witnessed being kicked out of jail." Now, it was later acknowledged by the King Center that Billy Graham was the one who bailed out Martin during his jail internment. Now, after nearly a year of intense activism with few tangible results, the movement began to deteriorate. And Martin requested a halt to all demonstrations and a day of penance to promote nonviolence and maintain the moral high ground. Now, divisions within the Black community and the canny, low-key response by local government defeated his efforts. Though the Albany effort proved a key lesson in tactics for King and the national civil rights movement, the national media was highly critical of King's role in the defeat and the SCLC's lack of results. I'm going to ask everybody to make sure that they're muted. Thank you. After Albany, King sought to choose engagements for which the SCLC could control the circumstances rather than entering into pre-existing situations. Again, determine the place and the time and the cause and how to protest peacefully. In April of 1963, the SCLC began a campaign against racial segregation and economic injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. Now, this campaign used nonviolent but intentionally confrontational tactics, and Black people in Birmingham, organizing with the SCLC, occupied public spaces with marches and sit-ins, openly violating laws that they considered to be unjust. Now, King's intent was to provoke mass arrests and to create a situation so crisis-packed that it will inevitably open the door to negotiation. However, the campaign's early volunteers did not succeed in shutting down the city or in drawing media attention to the police's actions. So the SCLC changed the course of the campaign by now recruiting children and young adults to join in their demonstrations. And Newsweek would call this a children's crusade. Now, during the protests, the Birmingham Police Department, led by this man, Eugene Bull Connor, used high-pressure water jets and police dogs against protesters, including children. Footage of the police response was broadcast on national television news, and it dominated the nation's attention, shocking many white Americans and consolidating Black Americans behind the movement. Not all of the demonstrators were peaceful, however, despite the avowed intentions of the SCLC. In some cases, bystanders attacked the police, who responded with brute force. And King and the SCLC were criticized for putting children in harm's way. But the campaign was a success. Bull Connor lost his job as police chief. The Jim Crow signs came down, and public places became more open to Blacks, and King's reputation improved immensely. Now, he was arrested and jailed early in this campaign, his 13th arrest out of what would become 29 total arrests. And from his cell, he composed the now famous letter from Birmingham jail, which responds to the calls of the movement to pursue legal channels for social change. And King argues that the crisis of racism is too urgent and the current system too entrenched. Quote, "We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed." And he points out that the Boston Tea Party, a celebrated act of rebellion in the American colonies, was illegal civil disobedience, and that conversely, everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was considered to be legal. He also expressed his frustrations with white moderates and clergymen who were too timid to oppose an unjust system. So in December of 1964, King and the SCLC joined forces with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the SNCC, in Selma, Alabama, where the SNCC had been working on voter registration for several months. What had happened is officials in these municipalities were giving African Americans these difficult exams with these difficult questions, and if they couldn't pass it, they couldn't register to vote. So a local judge issued an injunction that barred any gathering of 3 or more people affiliated with the SNCC, the SCLC, or with any of 41 named civil rights leaders. And this injunction temporarily halted civil rights activity until King defied it by speaking at Brown Chapel on January 2nd, 1965. Now, he was instrumental in the organization of the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, which took place on August 28, 1963. Other leaders and organizations comprising what were known as the Big Six were Roy Wilkins from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, Whitney Young, the National Urban League, A. Philip Randolph from the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, John Lewis from the SNCC, and James L. Farmer All of these people contributed to Martin's efforts in coordinating a Congress of racial equality. So King is most famous for his I Have a Dream speech. It was given in front of the Lincoln Memorial during the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And the march was originally conceived as an event to dramatize the desperate conditions of blacks in the southern United States and an opportunity to place the organizers in their goals squarely before the seat of power in the nation's capital. So, organizers intended to denounce the federal government for its failure to safeguard the civil rights and physical safety of civil rights workers and blacks. The march did, however, make specific demands. First, an end to racial segregation in public schools. Second, meaningful civil rights legislation, including a law prohibiting racial discrimination in employment. Third, protection of civil rights workers from police brutality. Fourth, a $2 minimum wage for all workers, regardless of race or color. 5, self-government for Washington, D.C., which was then governed by a congressional committee. So you can see the photo on the right. But despite tensions, the march was a resounding success. More than 250,000 people of diverse ethnicities attended the event, sprawling from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial onto the National Mall and around the reflecting pool. And at that time, it was the largest gathering of protesters in the history of Washington, D.C. Now, he would deliver a 17-minute speech, later known as the I Have a Dream speech, and in his most famous passage in which he departed from his prepared text, possibly at the prompting of Mahalia Jackson, who shouted behind him, "Tell them about the dream." And he said, quote, "I say to you today, my friends, so even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream." And let's see this right now. Here we go. And hopefully you can hear it.
John, can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear me? Can you hear this?
Yes.
Could you hear that okay?
Yes.
I can hear you, but I can't hear the speech if that's what you're playing.
Oh, you couldn't hear the speech. Oh, well, let me let me try it again. Here we go. I'm sorry about that.
Do the best you can.
Yeah, let's try it again. Okay. Let me try it one more time. I'm sorry, folks. I thought you could hear that. Can you hear that?
No.
Can you hear that?
Nope.
Oh. All right.
That's okay.
Hold on. Okay. Can you see my screen still?
Yes. King was instrumental in the organization of the March on Washington.
Okay. We hold these truths to be self-evident. Can you see that?
We have the other leaders and organizations comprising the Big Six with Roy Wilkins.
Okay.
So maybe you're free. It's frozen.
Okay. Can you see this now? Screen share is paused. Okay. Here's one second. I'm going to try something here.
No problem.
I'm sorry, folks. Stop
That's
sharing.
okay.
Okay. Let's try the sharing again. Ready?
Sure.
Okay, unfortunately, I will tell you that we do have, let me see, here we go. Can you see despite the tensions? Can you
Yes.
see? Okay, okay. So, folks, I will tell you that I have created a television program with 7 of Martin's speeches that Sharon is going to get a date later on in terms of when we'll show it, and all of his speeches are included on that. So can you hear me now?
Yes.
So unfortunately, I'm going to forego that because I didn't.
That's okay.
Usually it works, and I don't know. I've done
Not
this
a
multiple
problem.
occasions. I don't know. Here we go. So, anyways, more than 250,000 of people attended this rally. Just find my speech here. Okay. And again, it was the largest in DC's history. And again, this passage was one of the most famous that he gave in history, in the history of American public speaking. And he said, again, I say to you today, my friends, even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, I still have a dream. It is a dream deeply rooted in the American dream. Okay. So I Have a Dream became regarded as one of the finest speeches in the history of American oratory. And the march, and especially Martin's speech, helped put civil rights at the top of the agenda of reformers in the United States, and it facilitated the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And then came the march from Selma to Montgomery, a march to the state's capital. The first attempt to march was on March 7, 1965, but it was aborted because of mob and police violence against demonstrators. This day became known as Bloody Sunday and was a major turning point in the effort to gain public support for the civil rights movement. And it was the clearest demonstration up to that time of the dramatic potential of King's nonviolent strategy, even though there are violent people who were present. He met with officials in the Lyndon B. Johnson administration on March 5th in order to request an injunction against any prosecution of the demonstrator. And footage of the police brutality against the protesters was broadcast extensively, and it aroused national public outrage. Martin's next attempt to organize a march for March 9th to the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, then held a short prayer session before turning the marchers around and asking them to disperse so as not to violate the court order to disband. And the unexpected ending of the second march aroused the surprise and anger of many within the local movement. So the march went fully ahead on March 25th, 1965. And at the conclusion of the march on the steps of the state capitol in Alabama, Martin delivered the speech that became known as How Long? Not Long. And again, this is included in my television presentation. Beautiful speech. In it, King stated that the equal rights for African Americans could not be far away because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Now, Martin also opposed American involvement in the Vietnam War. And some of the things he was saying in 65, 66, and 67 hold true today about American imperialism abroad. Will determine who your leader is. And in April 4th, 1967 appearance of the New York City Riverside Church, exactly 1 year before his death, Martin delivered a speech titled Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence. And he spoke out strongly against the United States' role in the war, arguing that the U.S. was in Vietnam to occupy it as an American colony and calling the U.S. government the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. He also connected the war with economic injustice, arguing that the company needed serious moral change. In a true revolution, he said, of values will soon look uneasily on the glaring contrast of poverty and wealth. And with righteous indignation, it will look across the seas and see individual capitalists of the West investing huge sums of money in Asia, Africa, and South America, only to take the profits out with no concern for the social betterment of the countries, and say, this is not just. How true. Now, on April 15th, 1967, Martin spoke at an anti-Vietnam War march from New York Central Park to the United Nations, where he brought up issues of civil rights and the draft. And he said, I have not urged a mechanical fusion of the civil rights and peace movements. There are people who have come to see the moral imperative of equality, but who cannot yet see the moral imperative of world brotherhood. I would like to see the fervor of the civil rights movement imbued into the peace movement to instill it with greater strength. And I believe it has a duty to be in both the civil rights and peace movements, but for those who presently choose but one, I would hope that they would finally come and find common ground on both. The importance, he said, of the hippies is not their unconventional behavior, but in the fact that hundreds of thousands of young people, in turning to a flight from reality, are expressing a profoundly discrediting view on the society they emerged from. On January 13th, 1968, the day after President Johnson's State of the Union address, King called for a large march on Washington against one of history's most cruel and senseless wars. Quote, "We need to make clear in this political year to congressmen on both sides of the aisle and also to the President of the United States that we will no longer tolerate. We will no longer vote for men who continue to see the killings of Vietnamese and Americans as the best way of advancing the goals of freedom and self-determination in Southeast Asia." And in 1968, King, along with the SCLC, organized the Poor People's Campaign to address issues of economic justice. He traveled the country to assemble a multiracial army of the poor that would march on Washington to engage in nonviolent civil disobedience at the Capitol until Congress created an economic Bill of Rights for poor Americans. And on March 29, 1968, Martin went to Memphis, Tennessee, in support of the Black Sanitary Public Works employees represented by AFSCME Local 1733, who had been on strike since March 12th for higher wages and better treatment. Also, safety issues. 2 men were killed in the back of their truck. And in one incident, black street repairmen received pay for 2 hours when they were sent home because of rain, but white employees were paid for the whole day. Now, on April 3rd, he addressed a rally and delivered his "I've Been to the Mountaintop" address at Mason Temple, the world's headquarters in the Church of God in Christ. Can you see Martin's image here, folks?
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to just try to play it. His flight, by the way, had been delayed because there was a bomb threat against his plane. Can you see that now? Whoops, let's go back. Let's see. Can you hear that?
No.
I can't hear the speech.
No. John, we can't hear the speech. I don't think he can hear us.
Can you hear this?
No,
No?
no,
You couldn't see the speech?
no. We saw the slides. We did not hear his speech. So for some
Oh,
reason,
sorry. Okay, so I guess this has worked. I guess because I'm using your link, that maybe
Could be.
I cannot show my video from here, which is very unfortunate. But I will let you know that you can certainly see his entire speeches. I did several of them for a TV show I produced for the residents of Sudbury that will be aired in the future. But I apologize. I've never had this issue in hundreds of speeches, but I think it's because I didn't generate the link and I don't have full audio autonomy, so to speak. So I apologize for that. Disappointing. Anyways, that was the speech that he gave. It was eerie because, and you can hear me speaking, folks?
yes.
Okay. It was eerie because he was almost predicting his death. And he was solemn, strong, fearless, displaying valor that night because there were continual threats against his life. And Martin faced every single challenge that was given to him, especially the oppression by Southern Democrats who enforced policies against the black people, especially in the Deep South. And now it was coming to a boil in Memphis, Tennessee. And he was booked at the Lorraine Motel owned by Walter Bailey in Memphis. And he stayed so often at the Lorraine in Suite 306, it was known as the King Abernathy Suite. And according to Jesse Jackson, who was president at the time, Martin's last words on the balcony before his assassination were spoken to musician Ben Branch, who was scheduled to perform that night at an event King was attending. And he said, "Ben, Make sure you play Take My Hand, Precious Lord in the meeting tonight and play it real pretty. Martin was shot by James Earl Ray at 6:01 p.m., April 4th, 1968, as he stood on the motel's second floor balcony. And I'd like to pause here. Thanks. The bullet entered through his cheek and lodged in his spinal cord, and he died at 7:05 p.m. at St. Joseph's Hospital. Now, James Earl Ray killed Martin Luther King Jr. with a single shot fired from his Remington rifle. And on June 8th, 2 months after Martin's death, he was arrested at London's Heathrow Airport, attempting to leave the United Kingdom for Brussels, Belgium, on a false Canadian passport. Now, back to my opinion card at the beginning. I believe he was commissioned. He was not the lone gunman, just my opinion. He was commissioned and helped to obtain all of these false documents. There have been many specials on TV about this. In review, Martin Luther King Jr. was an American Baptist minister and activist who was a leader in the civil rights movement, known for his role in the advancement of civil rights using nonviolent civil disobedience based on his Christian beliefs. And he became an activist on civil rights early in his career, leading the 1955 Montgomery Bus Boycott, helping the Sclc, Southern Christian Leadership Conference, in 1957, serving as its first president. And he also led an unsuccessful 1962 struggle against segregation in Albany, Georgia, and he helped organize the 1963 nonviolent protests in Birmingham. And of course, the 1963 March on Washington, where he delivered his famous I Have a Dream speech. And on October 14, 1964, he received the Nobel Peace Prize for combating racial inequality through nonviolent resistance. If any man or woman should have received the Peace Prize, it's this man. He helped organize the Selma to Montgomery marches in 1965, took the Sclc movement north to Chicago to work on segregated housing, and in the final years of his life, he focused his efforts on opposition towards poverty and the Vietnam War, and unfortunately, he alienated many of his liberal allies with a speech in 1967 entitled Beyond Vietnam. Now, in 1968, he was planning a national occupation of Washington, D.C. to be called the Poor People's Campaign when he was assassinated on March 4th in Memphis, Tennessee. His death was followed by many riots in many U.S. cities. I do want to, if you can go online for this, James Brown saved Boston. James Brown, the soul singer, was scheduled to perform that night in Boston Garden. And Kevin White, the mayor, said, we got to postpone this. And he says, that's going to cause more trouble. Let the concert go on. So they let the concert go on. The police reported negligible violence as Brown sang on stage. At one point, some of the African-American fans in the audience came on stage, and the white police officers came from the flank. And James warded off the police officer. These are my people. Get away. And everybody went back to their seats. And he finished the show. And James Brown saved Boston that night. PBS did a wonderful special on that. And then, of course, Robert Kennedy was the one who told the minorities in Indianapolis, Indiana, that Martin was killed that night. So, in closing, he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and the Congressional Gold Medal. And, of course, Martin Luther Jr. King Day was established as a holiday in numerous cities and states beginning in 1971, but it became a U.S. federal holiday in 1986. And in closing, with this behind me, hundreds of streets in the U.S. have been renamed in his honor, and a county in Washington state was also renamed for him. And the Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial on the National Mall in Washington, D.C. was dedicated in 2011. Finally, Martin said, everybody can be great because anybody can serve. You only need a heart full of grace, a soul generated by love. That's my talk. I really appreciate your patience with the technical issues, everybody. Thank you so much.
Oh, that was good. Okay, so we're gonna unmute people. So that was very compelling. I learned an awful lot about Martin Luther King. Thank you, John.
Sure.
Let me see if anyone.
He was a child prodigy. He was a genius. He's
Yeah.
That's
Must
what he was.
be. Must be.
Do you have any questions, Alba?
Very impressive. Very impressive. I think I learned a lot. I mean, I know outlines. I've always known outlines of his life, but not this kind of like depth. But the only thing I kept thinking about is the fact that he was at some point questioning his Christian faith, but then ended up going, to become
Right.
himself.
He saw the Bible as a moral code of laws,
Mm.
and he said that it has so many inherent truths. But he had questions in terms of Christianity, the factions of Christianity, not only in the Protestant, they were fighting each other as well, and also with Catholics. So he struggled with that. And then, of course, Malcolm X, who had gone to Islam. I've done a lot of research about Malcolm X, and my theory is that he was assassinated by somebody put that because he was saying too many things that were disturbing some of the hard white aristocracy in the early to mid 1960s in the United States.
So do you think it might be the same group of people who assassinated King are the same people who might have been interested in killing Malcolm X?
Let me say it's the same. They had the same train of thought.
Yeah, so we have them now. I mean, they're all over. They've been all over in Washington, D.C. lately.
Right. But it's if you look at, I guess, the conspiracy, but John F. Kennedy, right? They had the lone gunman. Malcolm got killed. Then Martin, then Bobby Kennedy, right? It was all a lone gunman. But it was good to, I can see the whites saying that to get Malcolm out of the way, to get Martin out of the way, to get Kennedy out of the way, to get Robert Kennedy out of the way, because he would have ended the war in Vietnam. If you look back, 50, 60 years in the mentality, the closed-minded mentality that they had, these were people that wanted change and they had to be eliminated.
Yeah, well, actually, yeah, it's very difficult to tell because I think they never really found out who killed Martin Luther King.
They blamed it on James Earl Ray. Ray might have followed the shot, but I'm just saying he was commissioned, he was helped. And they dragged their feet in trying to apprehend James Earl Ray. But I will say, and if anybody else has any questions, as a speaker, and you can just see it, and I urge you to go online.
Amazing.
It's
amazing.
From the heart. No teleprompters, no memorization. He would scratch them out. He had a speechwriter, and he'd look at it, and he put it in his pocket. You don't see Martin Luther King. He only read one prepared statement that I have in my TV special, but he just spoke from the heart.
Amazing.
With rhythm to the point that he was preaching. That's his preaching background, blended so magnificently with his political intentions. And he was just able to deliver an impassionate lead to people. And finally, when the rest of the United States saw the police violence, they were horrified. And it finally brought attention to that. And I thought the way he conducted Selma marches, the 3 Selma marches.
Amazing. It's amazing. It's amazing. I saw a movie. I remember there's a movie about Selma, where they show all these,
Yep. Very good movie. Excellent movie.
A very good movie. Another thing is actually, this is the first time I hear about Robert Kennedy having tried to spy on Martin Luther King.
So
what do you think the reason was?
Okay, so well, the statement was that he was afraid that it would damage if these indiscreet disclosures were made. It would damage his brother's administration's efforts to bring civil rights. But then he goes and turns J. Edgar Hoover on him, and
Yeah, that's very strange. I found it very strange.
Hoover himself was just, as you know, he's a piece of work. I could rail on him all day, but I don't think in the end people say, would Martin and Bobby have been running mates in 1968? And I don't think so. No, I think though Martin would have run for president, not in 68, but maybe 72, and maybe I speculate that maybe Martin would have been elected in 76. In other words, there would be no Richard Nixon if Bobby Kennedy had lived. No Vietnam. So it's hard to speculate, but
so much have changed.
I mean, he never saw the age of 40. So does anybody else? Thank you so much for your questions. They're very, very insightful. Thank you. Does anybody else have a question? Rick. Okay.
And
I
then-
apologize, folks, for the audio issues. Don't know. But again, Sharon, you're all in touch with Sharon. She will let you know when it's aired on Sudbury TV.
I
I'd love
will.
you to see it. I did a good job editing, and it really, when you see his speeches about Vietnam and some of the speeches that you'd never hear about, then you'll understand how he was trying to take the peace hippie movement and meld it with civil rights, right? Even though they had different objectives, and it changed culture. So, well, anyways, thank you so much, Sharon. I appreciate it. Thanks, everybody. Peace
Well,
be with
thank
you.
you very much, John. Thank you, everyone, for taking time to log in.